Welcome back to the Line Table. The fight over oil and gas extraction around Chaco Cultural and National Historical Park took a turn in late April. It is not sitting well with environmentalists and indigenous activists. Federal Judge James Orrin Browning threw out a 2015 lawsuit that sought to protect the Chaco area, a site that is especially important to some New Mexico tribes. And Michael, a few weeks ago, the judge seemed to agree that some oil and gas drilling around Chaco Canyon did indeed violate historical preservation laws. But we have a bit of a turnaround. What do we know now? Where's this sitting now? Are we protected? Is Chaco protected now, or are we still in danger?
Well, I just wonder who jerked his chain in terms of his walking back his initial ruling.
Right.
I guess I would have to say, I just want to read something that was in the paper. Such a limitation makes sense as the archaeological site's historic value stems from the historical data, which was recoverable from the location and not the historical property setting or feeling associated with it. And it's just my thought, but I think he's definitely culturally unaware, incompetent, and historically also very not knowledgeable of the history and the value and the role this plays in the tradition of many tribes, specifically the Pueblo tribes, and just the inherent value in that site. And it's not just archaeological; it is part of a living history that continues to this day, because of the fact that the Pueblo people and other tribes see this as part of their, in fact, living history. So it's not just some old archaeological site. The other piece I think that's equally important is how would the general public out there, which is generally unaware of Indian values, traditions, philosophy, and belief systems, is nothing sacred?
Right.
And what if we were to propose something for Mount Rushmore? What if we were to propose gas and oil mining all around Mount Rushmore? How would people feel about that? Or what if we were to propose the same sort of activity around the Arlington Monument? Or to bring it home, what about the Santa Fe National Cemetery? How would people react and feel about that sort of activity? And I would tell you now that for me, it really cuts to the core of who I am, what I believe, and what I value, and it is totally disrespectful and does not acknowledge any of that relationship. I understand that non-Indian people see the Holy Land in the Middle East, and much of their religious philosophy and teachings tells them that's their Holy Land. Well, for us, who've been here for hundreds of thousands of years, our Holy Land is right here, right now. So this ruling, I think, is, not to mention the fact that it just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
We talk about New Mexico being this historical, multicultural, indigenous area, which touts tourism. And what we're talking about is a World Heritage Site,
right,
not something that just is valuable to New Mexico or the nation, but in fact the world. And there are people in the world. This is not a designation that comes easily, and it's significant. And so I just think it's extremely extremely ignorant and really insensitive.
I appreciate your thoughts on that. And Dee Dee, if you would pick up on that, I have to agree with Michael. When I read in the judge's statement that one's feelings about it counts for nothing, I was stunned by that. I couldn't even imagine. I appreciate your point about if it was Arlington National Cemetery, you would have feelings about it. If there was drilling within, 3 miles or 2 miles or 1 mile, there would be feelings about it. So your sense of it.
Well, I think he put it very well, and I think he expressed how much of a slap in the face this is to Native Americans here in New Mexico, and what a damaging perception it is to people who would like to come and visit this UNESCO World Heritage Site. Right. I mean, this is reserved for places like Angkor Wat or Machu Picchu.
That's right.
These are, you know, historic cultural sites that, you know, we can't do without them because we've got to know our history. Regardless of whether you're a Native American or not, you must know the history of this area in order to be a full human being. And this ruling is, you know, is a reversal, and it is suspicious in that way, although the stated reason is that they're waiting for the BLM to do a full master plan for the area.
Right.
Well, you know, I think that's, you know, if you're going to put your eggs in the basket of the BLM, I think it's going to be a scrambled egg,
right.
because I don't have much faith in them anymore, and I really feel that oil and gas and fracking will have seismic implications. It will have water quality implications.
That's right.
It will have noise and visual implications that will damage this historic and very important site.
That's right, irreversibly, possibly, as a matter of fact. Laura, your sense of this ruling, again, it's not over. In fact, Interior Secretary Zinke is calling for a bit of a pullback as well to look at a lot of different things. Do we have a chance for a reversal here, a reversal of the reversal? Do we have a chance at some point here? Or?
Certainly the plaintiffs here, the environmental coalition that's been working with the indigenous groups, have an opportunity to appeal to the 10th Circuit. That's certainly an option. I would expect that there's enough feeling, for lack of a better term, there's enough of a feeling that this was something that was really, you know, people were very disappointed by this, very unhappy, especially given that he had had a preliminary ruling and then came back and sort of was completely reversed.
Right.
Reversed that preliminary ruling. It really is, I think there's enough interest there and support for appealing it to the 10th Circuit. Now the 10th Circuit is not necessarily any more, I mean, we're talking about federal judges in general who are pretty conservative.
Sure.
But if you, and conservative in the sense that they're, you know, they're really by the letter, looking at the law, interpreting that. And so I think the opinion, it is, I can understand the feeling of offensiveness when that issue of feeling that particular line was offensive. And I see that. As an attorney, I have to be careful about criticizing sitting judges. So I'm going to be careful to do that. But I will say that I understand where that came from in terms of people being really offended by it. At the same time, he's applying what is currently on the books with regard to NEPA. And that's really, NEPA is the process that all the federal agencies have to use to do an environmental review. And it's admittedly limited. It's limited in its scope. There's also the National Historic Preservation Act, which is also, you know, limited. And the problem is that we're talking about an industry that has developed and has other ramifications beyond just citation, like citing it.
Gotcha.
So what they said is because it's not, you know, basically because it's not within the park itself, the canyon, then it's okay, but it's not taking into account all these other externalities that the industry has. Many of them are light pollution at night. I mean, the flaring aspect of it, and anybody who's ever spent time in southeastern New Mexico sees this. The flaring is amazing. You know, you see it for miles, and so that affects light in that area. A whole area.
Air quality.
Air quality becomes a huge issue. You know, noise pollution, traffic. I mean, if you drive on the roads like I do in southeastern New Mexico regularly, there's serious traffic issues with the big trucks down there, and there's also just road quality issues. So you're talking about a lot of externalities that I don't think that those laws currently take into effect or take into consideration when the federal agencies do their NEPA. NEPA work.
That's right.
So I think we have an issue of sort of the cultural balance with the legal issue, and it hasn't really caught up to where it needs to be to take into account these externalities.
That's right. Good point there. New Mexico Oil and Gas Association is in favor of this ruling. They have been against the first ruling. They were pretty vocal about that. Ryan Flynn has a lot of quotes out there about, you know, protecting the environment and maintaining New Mexico's cultural treasures are of the utmost importance, are a priority for the oil and gas operators, but then you got this other side of the argument too. You know what I mean? Are they trying to have it both ways here? Trying to, you know, we want to be able to get what we want, but we want to say that we're protecting our cultural heritages as well.
You know,
so.
I don't think so.
Okay.
And the reason I say I don't think so is because I think Laura made a great point, right? I mean, we keep talking about you right after Mike spoke, you were like, well, the feelings. We don't make law based on feelings. We make law based on fact. And so we have.
I would agree with you, except that the judge decided to put it in there as part of his ruling.
I understand.
So somehow,
right? He's saying that he's not taking that into account.
Okay.
Which is siding with the way common law in this state, in this country, has been written.
Gotcha.
We don't go into the person's mind and say we're going to predetermine what someone's thinking, so their feeling aspect. I think that if these laws are not, like Laura said, if these laws are missing things, the way to change the law is not to ask a judge to rule against the law, it's to change the law. Is there a problem with the way some of this stuff is thought out? I'm not denying that. I'm not denying that there's been decisions made based on laws that are archaic, sitting on the books, that don't take new information into consideration. But to say you want Judge Browning to make a ruling based on these outside factors, you need to be careful, because if you ask Judge Browning to do that, then the next judge can say, well, I'm going to ignore the law over here, and I'm going to make a ruling that I think is the best thing to do. And so at the end of the day, the real problem isn't Judge Browning's ruling. The real problem is the process that's been implemented for these folks to go through. I think it's unfair from a business perspective to say we're going to lay out the rules from which you get to play the game, and then when the rules are followed, we don't like the outcome, well, now we're going to add some more rules. Now we're going to add some more rules. I think what the oil and gas guys are saying, we just want some consistency. Look, do I want to go up the Chaco Canyon and park next to an oil derrick? No, I don't. Do I think as an individual that we should be taking into consideration the comments that Mike made about indigenous people and their tribal lands? I believe 100% we should be. But if that's not the way the law is written, those folks that are coming in from outside that could care less, and to Mike's point, you know, they started drilling at Arlington National Cemetery. These guys that are at Chaco Canyon, if there's gas at Arlington National Cemetery, they drive over a grave in a minute to put a pump in there. There's no doubt about it.
Yep.
They could care less.
Which is why we need laws and rules.
That's right.
And
so
regulations.
the problem is I think this points out a greater problem in our country right now. We are not forcing the legislative branch and the executive branch to do their job. We're relying on the judicial branch to intercede and do it. And I think this is a great example that we should be going back to our congressmen, our U.S. senators, and say, you got rules and laws that are flawed, fix them.
Yeah, there you go. Now, later, when we come back to the line, we'll look at how getting medical cannabis is not always that easy.